So, Ann Peterman, welcome to Breaking Green.
Thanks so much, Steve.
You have headed an international delegation of the Stop GE Trees campaign to Brazil.
We decided to do this in Brazil because in 2021, the government of Brazil legalized the commercial release of trees, eucalyptus trees, genetically engineered for herbicide resistance.
It's hard to understand until you see it yourself, how the term green desert applies to eucalyptus plantations.
Yeah, it's exactly. They are green deserts, and not just because they have no biodiversity. People can't live in them either. People can't use them. They provide no food for wildlife. The leaves that fall off the trees actually have a toxic compound in them, which suppresses any other vegetation from being grown. And then there are literal deserts in the fact that they're just taking all the water.
There is a history of resistance to eucalyptus plantations in Brazil.
There is, exactly. When we, at Global Justice Ecology Project, first traveled to Brazil, which was in 2005, we visited these communities that had literally gone into the plantations, cut them down, and then used the wood to build structures and houses, community centers, and so on. People basically taking back their land, or in the case of the MST, which stands for the Landless Workers Movement, having a place for landless people where they could live, where they could grow crops, where they could, be together and have a life, as opposed to having to go to the cities and live in the slums. So people feel like the MST feels like the eucalyptus plantations are not a productive use of the land, and under the Brazilian Constitution, unproductive land can be taken by landless people for the purpose of living and growing crops and so on. So they interpreted that to include eucalyptus plantations, and they're still doing it today. So we visited not the exact same communities, but nearby communities that are doing the same work. They're still trying to take over pieces of these eucalyptus plantations, trying to get their land rights back from the timber companies so that they can reestablish their territories where the eucalyptus plantations have taken over.
Fibra e hoje é atual Suzano.
We're in an area dominated by the paper and pulp companies. When we came, it was Aracruz, then became Fibra, and now is Suzano.
Completou agora o dia 23 de maio 7 anos de luta e resistência contra as papeleiras, né?
On May 23rd, we celebrated the 7th anniversary of the beginning of our struggle against the paper and pulp industry.
Com a nossa produção de alimento saudável.
That includes our production of healthy food.
A gente pode sim produzir o alimento saudável que serve para nos alimentar, mas também para alimentar a sociedade da qual a gente tem essa pertença, a necessidade de se sentir parte dela também com a produção de alimentos.
And we are sharing with society at large that we are able to, in areas where there is eucalyptus, we can produce healthy food that's good for us to survive on, and also to provide food to the society at large that we are part of as well.
Como vocês podem conferir, aqui é parte do que a gente produz no acampamento.
In the table in front of us, you see part of what we produce here in the camp.
Que é aí a laranja,
Oranges,
a banana,
bananas,
a melancia,
watermelon,
o aipim,
the manioc,
e o café, né?
And coffee.
Então isso aqui é tudo que a gente produz, aqui em torno, onde vocês podem olhar aqui, era tudo
much
eucalipto.
of what we produce here in areas that were once covered by eucalyptus.
E dizer que mesmo sabendo que a luta não é fácil,
even though we know the struggle is not easy,
mas seguimos em resistência na luta pela terra,
we're still resisting in the struggle for our land.
E contra a empresa Suzano,
and against the Suzano Corporation.
e o plantio de eucalipto.
and against the planting of eucalyptus.
E defendemos a produção de alimentos saudáveis.
And we defend the production of healthy food.
E além da produção, quando a gente veio para cá,
So also, in addition to just farming when we come here,
com a tarefa de resgatar a comunidade,
our task has been to recover communities.
que a igreja que vocês estão vendo estava destruída,
The church, the chapel that you see over here had been destroyed.
reconstruímos
We
e aqui
rebuilt it.
hoje está presente a comunidade
Today it's present in our community
com celebrações e missas. Então,
with celebrations and masses.
todos os vizinhos que aqui tem em torno não acreditavam que hoje poderia estar dessa forma.
All the neighbors around this region didn't believe that it would be recovered this way.
Mas o MST veio e resgatou a comunidade.
But the MST came to recover the community. He and his wife.
Esse aqui é meu irmão, né? Que veio aqui ajudar o café. E o outro meu irmão ali que veio ajudar o café. Porque eu tô com. Que eu se machuquei, né? Estão me ajudando.
How long have they been here?
Há quanto tempo que estão produzindo aqui neste lote?
Aqui, 5 anos.
5 years.
How long is he going to be
De
here?
5 anos
E
produzindo.
quantos anos mais lhe restam de trabalho aqui?
Aqui? Rapaz, vai até aguentar, né?
As long as I can take it.
Mais uns 5 anos ainda, até aguentar.
5 years. O que o senhor teria para sugerir ou para perguntar
No rio pra roça, né?
is thrown away into the
poço.
river, anything.
Esgoto nenhum, nem
There's no
pariu, nem
sewage,
nada.
no-
Só isso aí, sempre procurar de fazer um poço
residues.
artesiano que te serve para você
We've got
molhar a
an-
roça e
our-
casa.
We've got an artesian wells that gives us water for irrigation and for our home consumption.
Ela vê, né, assim, que é a luta de um sem terra, como diz, de um MST, né? Que nós, eu mais ela, somos que nós somos uma turma do MST mesmo.
MST group.
Nós perde,
We're the real
mas não
MST
entrega. Nós
movement.
podemos perder, mas que nós somos
We're
MST.
part of this. Whether we win or lose, that's what we are.
Né, Josimara? Nós perdemos, mas nós somos MST, né?
We might lose, but we're still MST.
Bom, agora ali, ó.
We went to Mato Grosso do Sul to look at the massive expansion of eucalyptus plantations that's going on right now. And we met with a community called the Ofayé. They were originally on this very rich territory where they could hunt and they could fish. Fishing was a major part of their tradition and, you know, how they fed themselves. And they were relocated to a part of land that was away from the river because the power company wanted the river for a hydroelectric dam. So they were relocated from their traditional territory next to the river and put on this piece of land that was far away from the river. Then that land they had to move away from as well onto this territory where we visited them. So this very small piece of land that if you look at it from a Google map image, from an aerial view image, you can see it's just this little island of lush forest in the middle of a soy monoculture. On one side, sugarcane on another side, and eucalyptus plantations on the other side. So it's kind of it was a very sad thing.
Era povo muito grande, né?
This was a very large people in the past,
No ano de 1900, né?
around 1900.
Então, quase chegamos sim à extinção, né?
We were almost
Mas hoje nós estamos aqui, né? Para
destroyed,
poder
or went to
lutar, né,
extinct
pelos nossos
state.
direitos.
But people
E
started fighting for our
lutar
rights.
pela nossas terras, né? Pelo nosso território.
To struggle for our land, our territory.
E o que fez nós perder toda a nossa cultura foi
What made
todas
us
as
lose
perseguições.
our land, our culture was all
do-
the persecution
Do agronegócio, né?
by agribusiness.
Que ele não chegou agora, né? Ele já veio antes para
It's
poder
been
nos
here for a
destruir, né?
long time. It's not
Destruir
a
as
new
nossas
thing.
florestas.
They destroyed our forests,
As nossas águas.
our water.
E eu não sei como que vai ser o
I
futuro
don't
da nossa
know
água no futuro,
about
né?
the future of our
Agora,
water
a nossa floresta,
now,
agora e as nossas
but
terras,
our forest and our
ela
land
foi tudo
here
destruído já.
was destroyed.
E
At that
e
time.
nós, índios, né, se
And we
preocupamos, né,
indigenous people are very
com o
concerned,
mundo, com o Brasil todo, né?
worried about the world and Brazil
Não somente
as a
o povo
whole.
da Amazônia, mas
Not
também
just
nós, né?
the Amazon people,
Nós
but
dependemos
our
da
peoples
natureza para
as
nós
well. We
poder
depend on
respirar
nature to
um ar
breathe
puro, um ar
pure
saudável.
air, healthy
E
air.
isso não nos preocupa muito.
That is
para
a
nosso
great
futuro.
concern of ours.
But the community itself was very resilient. They had their own school. They were teaching the children about the history of the Ofayé people. They were teaching the children their traditional language. They had managed to resurrect the language that was almost lost. And so it was a really inspiring story in that respect of people that were determined that their culture shall continue, even though there are only about 100 members of the community that are left after all of these relocations.
Somos resistência por ter nascido, ter resistido à escravidão, uma escravidão que veio exterminar vários povos, e um dos nossos por não lutarem, ser um povo pacífico, por ser um povo ser coletor e caçador. Não é um povo aguerrido que vai e mata o outro para conquistar território. Não, nós preservávamos o nosso território. E por causa dessa pacificidade que houve esse extermínio, essa destruição. Você pensar que em 60 ter 10 mil indígenas, 5 mil indígenas, em 2023 você ter 33 famílias com outros povos, mais ou menos 50 Ofayé. Então, é resistir o tempo, persistir a história. Revitalizar uma história, ela não parte só de um momento, ela parte desse momento, onde vocês guardam na cabeça e levam nossa história para longe, para mostrar que nós nunca...
When you were in Brazil, there was a large protest.
There are hundreds of indigenous groups in Brazil that are trying to get back the lands that were stolen from them over the years through different means. Many of the struggles that the indigenous peoples have been waging for several decades have in fact resulted in some land title, resulted in some land demarcation victories. But there has just been, while we were in Brazil, in fact, this law called PL 490 is what it's called in Congress. It basically opens up indigenous people's lands for extraction even more than it already is, and strips many of the indigenous people's land demarcation titles that have been won. It strips them away.
Fala o seu nome, desculpa. Então, meu nome é Cretan Caingangue, eu sou da região sul do Brasil. E nós estamos reunidos hoje, no dia de hoje aqui, mas não só aqui, mas em todo o Brasil também, mobilizados contra a PL 490. Essa PL, ela passando aqui pela Câmara dos Deputados, ela vem num formato de ameaça a todo o direito nosso como povos originários. E a gente sabe que no dia de hoje a única pauta que tem é a PL 490. Então é necessário que nós nos mantenhamos organizados, mas é importante também que os movimentos que tem fora do Brasil, principalmente americano, né, que mantenha junto com nós essa luta, porque se nós for afetados aqui no Brasil, o mundo será afetado. Porque a PL 490 ela licencia tudo que for de maldade para a questão ambiental, para a questão do garimpo, a questão conforme o interesse do Estado, né, pode-se fazer revisão de terras já homologadas, então a demarcação ela se torna muito vulnerável. Então é importante manter a luta e que movimentos sociais, políticos, né, americanos aí se pronunciem contra essa PL 490, porque não é só nós, os povos originários, os povos indígenas, que vamos sofrer com essa PL. Todos vão sofrer com essa PL, o mundo vai sofrer com a PL, porque ataca diretamente nós que somos os principais responsáveis pelas questões, pela defesa da questão ambiental no Brasil e também pelas mudanças climáticas que hoje está acontecendo em todo o Brasil. Então é necessário uma unidade muito grande, não só nós aqui, mas em todo o mundo, todos aqueles que estiverem nos ouvindo nesse momento.
The delegation was a very diverse delegation, which was great. So we had people join the delegation from as far away as Japan and New Zealand. We had people from North America, South America. We had a lot of indigenous participation from Latin America. We had Mapuche participation, a Guarani woman from Argentina. We had some really excellent people from Brazil, from a group called Ofayé, which is a group that's been around for decades doing work similar and related to what we do.
So on this trip, this tour through Espírito Santo and the communities, the Quilombola communities, the MST communities, all of these communities impacted by industrial monocultures, by the toxics, by the lack of water, by the loss of land. Ofayé's been very integral, not only in organizing that trip, but in those issues over time.
So the campaign to stop GE trees, it comes to Ofayé with a national network that we are part of, that is the Rede Alerta contra Desertos Verdes. That will be the network against green deserts. That was created in the early 2000s in the north of the Espírito Santo, much related with the indigenous struggle against, at that time, Aracruz Cellulose. That was the company that arrived in those traditional people territories in the 70s, land grabbing and very violently, and related to the military dictatorship that was in Brazil at this time. This company, during the early 2000s, had a very big struggle with especially indigenous people in the municipality of Aracruz that gave the name to the company at that time. So they stole also that. They helped to marginalize indigenous people and their rights and their struggle, also with public opinion, and attacked it very directly. In this context, the network against green deserts in Brazil comes along. And it helps to motivate a lot the Quilombolas in the north part of the state to also unite against the company and all its violations in the territories. The indigenous people, they managed to recover some part of their territory and made an agreement with the company at the time in 2007. And after that, and motivated by that also, a lot of Quilombola fights started to take place and started to unify against the company. With time, this company decided to rebrand it and became Fibria. But it didn't change their ways with the people. They changed the communication. They tried to be more present within the communities, to start to have some social projects as if it would change something that they made and all the illegal lands that they were occupying by them. There are many reports on how Fibria, Aracruz, and now Suzano, because when Suzano buys Fibria, all the history of violations, it doesn't go away. So Suzano is also responsible for everything that it has entailed with buying the former company. All the lack of water, all the issues of contamination, all the small rivers and lakes that disappeared with the eucalyptus plantations that were actually planted inside those zones that are supposed to be protected by the Brazilian law, and all with the agrochemicals that are aerial sprayed over the communities with no respect to their territories, even their privacy, because their surveillance cars are day and night monitoring those communities and what they are doing.
Quilombolas are actually descendants of escaped African slaves, and they have their own communities, their own territories in some of the forested regions and in many regions that are now surrounded by eucalyptus plantations, and they are also seeking territorial sovereignty. They were talking about security from the companies invading their communities. So, just really regressive repression that these people are experiencing. So we were documenting all of that and bringing it to the government in Brasilia.
Todas as maneiras que vocês pensarem.
There are all kinds of activities under here, everything you could imagine.
Perante a justiça, vamos dizer,
in the justice,
MPF,
system,
Ministério Público Federal, Defensoria Pública da União, isso aqui está tudo denunciado. Violações de direitos, impactos ambientais, muitas concentrações de venenos, muita saúde mental, Ali vocês estão vendo a saída desse plantio.
You see this harvest taking place.
Esse daqui não tem uma semana.
Is just a week old that it sprouted.
Agora, veja a concentração de água.
Look at all the concentration of water. How much water is in that root system?
Na verdade, isso aqui é um gel.
This is a gel.
Faz de uma forma que não morra.
It keeps the tree from dying. Not a good idea.
Quilombola communities in that region who are suffering very directly the impacts of eucalyptus plantations, literally surrounded by them in some cases, as well as sugarcane plantations. So they were talking to us directly about what the impacts are that they are experiencing. And as I've mentioned, the loss of water and the contamination from chemicals are already at the top of that. So changing the plantations over to genetically engineered trees would only make that worse.
Assim, na nossa comunidade, que a gente vive e convive, né? Na comunidade.
What do we know about the community? Because we live here.
Há dos felizes e infelizes também.
There are happy facts and sad facts.
Nós temos muita falta de água.
There is a great lack of water.
Veneno por nosso estado, município e comunidade é demais.
Poison
é o que mais mata a gente.
State,
é por cima, é por baixo, é veneno mesmo das empresas.
A lot. And it comes from the companies that are around.
Que eu informei que hoje é da Suzano e da Alcon, né, que está tomando conta da DISA, que antes era a DISA.
E pelo ar é avião,
os dois. Drone e avião.
From air, by plane, by drone.
Por cima, passa em cima da casa da gente, em cima da roça, em cima das nossas plantações.
On our crops.
Que nós temos problema com que a gente entrega e não pode conter veneno. Nós não usa.
Because we don't use pesticides or herbicides. It's all organic, but because of the drones that spread out the poison, the pesticide and so on, it goes over and goes on our crops. And because of that, we have many issues because we can't sell our organic crops because they're not supposed to have chemicals on them.
We traveled to Brasilia, which is the capital, and met with different ministries of the government where we spoke to them about the demands from the communities and groups that we met with in Espírito Santo and Bahia, presented those demands to the ministries very formally and also in person in meetings. We were fortunate enough to have a woman from one of the Quilombola communities that came with us to the meetings with the ministers.
As a Quilombola person, I'm pleased to see Indigenous people in the Indigenous ministry because we live the same reality, and everything that Quilombolas experience, Indigenous people also experience. And we know very well that the Suzano company has fooled us, been fooling us ever since our ancestors' time, showing us a fake reality. And if we've already been suffering with normal eucalyptus, imagine what we might experience with transgenic eucalyptus, what it can cause to us from here on. If we're already suffering so much with normal eucalyptus that has been impacting us in the water, in the soil, with the pesticides, that's what I think. That from here on, it will not be easy, our struggle. If the struggle is already difficult today, then try to just imagine the future with new aggressions of pesticides. So I'm here to ask the ministry to help us to get legislation to stop the transgenics in our Indigenous Quilombola and land reform areas with the MSTs to not suffer more what we have been suffering for a long time now.
The Minister of Indigenous Peoples was, for obvious reasons, as we've talked about with the regressive law going through Congress, a little bit distracted and focused on, their own agenda at that moment. But the Minister of the Environment was extremely supportive of the demands and had a lot of ideas on how those demands could be advanced and addressed, as well as did the Ministry of Agrarian Development. And, that's basically the Ministry of Small Farmers, if you will.
That's another point. I'd like to make a few comments in general on several of these points that have been raised. I confess to you that just yesterday, when we got the demand, they asked for this meeting, I was thinking of, as an agronomist, thinking of a little bit about our agenda. And with what the researcher and professor, I was thinking about how hard it is for us to think about all the different indirect impacts of planting eucalyptus. This life cycle, and how many experiments would have to be done, the height of the plants, all that goes into a very complex field, and it makes no sense in my vision to have a transgenic associated with glyphosate. It's a crop that in a few years it grows up, gives shade, and it ends up developing anyway. It's much more linked to market interests of the corporations that want to sell herbicides than to any agronomical interest in production.
But overall, the meetings were positive. Our Quilombola representative left feeling good, like she had new tools to bring back to her community that could help them with their land demarcation process, with their fight against Suzano and the eucalyptus plantations. These companies will get carbon credits for destroying the forest and putting in these industrial tree monocultures for pulp and paper mills. Because they're, literally growing trees, and that's what forest carbon offsets are given for, is for literally growing trees. It doesn't matter that you've just destroyed a carbon-rich forest to grow this very paltry plantation. So when you destroy a native forest, the native Cerrado forest, besides releasing all of that carbon out of the soil and out of the trees and all of the life that used to be in that forest, you're putting in these eucalyptus plantations that don't store very much carbon at all and will be harvested in 3 to 5 years to be turned into pulp and paper, which will put the carbon right back into the atmosphere. Suzano is doing that. So they're getting the money for the pulp and paper, they're getting money for the forest carbon offsets, and the result in Brazil is just a hellscape.
All of these are main struggles of traditional people's fights, and request for rights. And the campaign, I believe, comes within that to help those impacts have the attention in the public opinion that it needs. It's still very hard to make people understand how eucalyptus plantations are actually a bad thing. Because when people think about trees, they think that it's a good thing. They are reforestating, but it's not like that at all. And it takes people from the communities to tell people that live in the cities what it's like and what they are doing, and that it needs to stop. So by engaging against the GE trees plantations in Brazil by Suzano and by the other companies that are working with that, we're also enhancing the fight against the green deserts and against the use of agropesticides and against also the land grabbing of those companies. So I believe it's very hard to separate all these campaigns because they are all trying just to give basic rights back to the people and give them the sovereignty to run their territories, to plant their food, and be able to still have their traditions and life.